What do you think dogs and innovation and design have in common?
They're very curious. Dogs are really good at sniffing things out.
And in design, people sniff things out?
Just sort of perpetual question asking, curiosity, discovery, maybe a bit naive, getting your nose into things you shouldn't, maybe being a bit aggressive and defensive about your ideas. That also is a big thing. Being territorial. Some dogs are very territorial. Some people in design, product development, innovation are very territorial. Arts and crafts I find it very therapeutic. If you're really busy and your mind's always going with something and maybe things aren't working out very well, you need to sort of have your hands do something. A couple of years ago, I was going through a period of trials and tribulations, and I had some friends getting married, and I had a lot of cardboard sitting around. And I just started this habit where you would trace out, print out traces of different types of masks and draw them out. And then I'd have friends over, and we would just I had like an arts and crafts box, and then we would just make these like masquerade masks basically with things. And so the wedding was in Munich a couple of years ago. And so I came with this massive suitcase because it's a lot of masks. Like if you have like around 100 masks, it's a lot. So I showed up and then I put them in, like the ceremony was on the main floor, and then it was in a farm, like a really nice loft of a farm that was where the dancing was. After dinner, everyone came up and we had set up all the masks all around. It was one of my best arts and crafts memories because there was this moment where everybody came up and they were picking the mask and they were all so excited. They're like, what? This is crazy. These are all these handmade silly masks.
You said you found it very therapeutic, and you also tell on LinkedIn that you're a product therapist for a PhD. Is that
Yeah.
somehow connected?
I never thought about that, whether those things are connected, but I think that when you're a researcher or when you're working with researchers who are trying to create a product or translate their research into something commercializable, like it's super stressful and people need some guardrails for thinking. They need to create some simple constraints, some baselines to keep them focused and to let them know what they can ignore. And that's therapeutic. And the arts and crafts, actually, that's a pretty good connection. I hadn't never thought of that, because the thing I like about arts and crafts is they're, because you're using these like basic materials and garbage, or maybe you have like rhinestones and hot glue. There's only 6 things you can use, so the constraints are pretty clear. And there's no real expectations. That state of mind, I think, is actually what you need when you're starting things out. Like people have too many expectations about things being perfect. Our first prototype needs to be perfect, and our messaging needs to be perfect. I guess I kind of try and bring that same freedom into working with people. Does that make sense?
Do you think the options to create more freedom by reducing the pressure to deliver minimalistic?
If people have too many options to choose from, they get overwhelmed and they don't make any decisions. That's at every level. Like if you're a kid making arts and crafts or you're an executive trying to make a decision on some strategy, the work is about using constraints that everybody agrees upon to narrow down your options to 3. There's 3 options and they roughly meet your problem or meet your needs.
What I now have in mind is Marie Kondo, and you're like joining a researchy project maybe, and then you're like, okay, let's throw this out, we don't need this and that. Is that how it looks like?
I mean, you want to get people to sort of communicate what their goals are.
Yeah.
Like what's the possibility they're trying to move towards? What are the needs connected to each of those possibilities? Because depending on what stage of a project you're in or what type of team you're working for, the needs are completely different, and you can have all kinds of assumptions. So narrowing things down and creating sort of a simple framework for what the end goal is and what the results are, and how do you measure quality, what's important. Yeah, it's just a process of constraining people. Just by creating the constraints that everyone agreed to, people generally come to ease. They get calmed down. And in a deep tech commercialization environment, most of the people that I worked with they did a postgrad studies and did postgrad money, or they got some grant funding, and it's like brand new for them. It's a different world, and investors are intimidating and they have it all figured out. So you need to listen to what they say. or that's the impression. Yeah, so that process of constraining the problem, training the goals. What do you mean, the process or the outcome?
Yes. How do you get there?
The first step is always like, what's the vision? What's the story? What's the intent? Can you get people to align on what their intent is? In terms of what's the outcome? That's sort of the first phase. The next phase is like, what are the needs, right? What are the constraints for that target? You have this vision, vision for this ideal world, this thing you want to create, or this possibility your research enables, or whatever. And then how do you constrain that, right? What's the value, right? Clear vision. What's the value? Then once you're clear what the value could be, how do you take action? How do you get there? What's the practical steps? So it's sort of like three general phases. Maybe to go into more detail. If you're trying to create a vision, like what's the point of the vision? The vision isn't just to inspire yourself, but it's to inspire technical people, people to join you, people to fund you, people to take you seriously in in deep tech, right? It's deep because it's complicated, right? So if you're an academic by default, you're using different language, using specialized language, you're an expert in a field that a fraction of the world understands. So the first step is sort of framing your discovery in a way that people can comprehend it. And that's a huge, I say it's a first step because it's a big issue, right? How do you create an analogy? How do you use a meme? How do you put a picture in someone's mind about what you actually did and why it's relevant? And how can you sort of connect that technical thing you created, or that scientific discovery you created, to that vision, right? To this future world, because of this, if this, then that, and then how do you correctly communicate where you want to go such that it sparks curiosity in somebody, right? Specifically like the engineers or the business people or the marketers, whoever, that you want to come on your journey, right? So all those three things are sort of the first aspect of creating a vision.
What follows after the vision?
Then you want to sort of prototype, right? One of the big issues is people feel like a real urgency to get started and to actually build something, right? And they usually start building something before they've really defined or validated what you should actually be building, maybe based on something that else that already exists. So the first thing is like, what's the actual opportunity? You've created this discovery, you can communicate this discovery, you can communicate the vision, right? How's the world going to change as a result of this vision, right? But how's the world going to change in terms of the market? What is the job to be done that's being solved? People hire a product or hire a service because you're solving a pain point, a job to be done. Can you map that out? What's the workflow of that ideal customer, that person that represents the market? Where do they start? What's the input to that system? Where do they end? A to B. What are all the steps in that workflow? And within each of these steps, what are the needs that are being addressed? And how does that relate to an existing product, right? What are the unmet needs that are being addressed, that aren't being addressed? And how does your solution meet those needs, those unmet needs, faster, better, cheaper than the other guy? That market mapping, from my perspective, is the first step, because it allows you to isolate what features you should build first. How do you prioritize what you should build, right? Okay, you've created some useful discovery, but is it a discovery that addresses a problem faster, better, cheaper at all? Or is it just some fancy tech that you're trying to push on the market? Both could maybe work, but at least you need to be honest with yourself about it. Let's say you've isolated what the unmet need is, then the question becomes, how do you build the thing? If people are in academia, maybe they haven't spent that much time actually building what they should build, and they've validated that customers actually want that problem solved somehow. How do they architect a solution around that? Is it hardware? Is it software? Is it, what's the product architecture? And in that case, it's more very high level. What's the system? What are the subcomponents? What do we actually have to build? What should we buy? Should we integrate multiple systems that already exist? How should we build the first thing? What's the long-term architecture, right? This is still, you haven't built anything. You're just planning and pricing things out. And what's the business case? So now you have a rough idea of your vision. You have a rough idea of what's your market, what's your architecture. So you must have an idea now what the rough costs will be and what the opportunity will be. So you have to sort of build a model. Is this still worth it? So now you've sort of completed phase 2, right? What's your prototyping clarity, right? And again, this is sort of like a cascading process of building clarity. And then the last thing is, okay, building momentum, right? How can you like get your team to build this? So now you have a vision to inspire them. You have a rough plan of like where you want to go, but how do you communicate to people so that they like take action in the right way? So then it comes back to like, how do you value rank the things to build first and things to test first? So you've got your like your isolated market needs, your architecture, the opportunity for each. Like basic, I like to think of this idea as 10% prototyping. So you maybe have like in a new diagnostics machine, okay, and there's 3 key features that are the super valuable thing. But the 3 key features each have some technical innovation that's really tricky and hard to solve. How do you prove 10% of it? What's the big technical hurdle? Can you build the 10% of the solution? Focus on getting that done first, right? To sort of eliminate all the technical risks. Can you actually prove that this is feasible, right? Because in deep tech, sometimes it takes years to actually solve those problems, right? Maybe 80% of the solution is all pre-existing technology, software interfaces, or hardware that already exists, but there's a couple of core elements. So how do you isolate those as quickly as possible and prioritize your build? You're going to need very specialized people. Very specialized people like specialized problems. So how do you continue? How do you keep them? How do you string them along? So how do you communicate with the right type of person to get them engaged and committed to solve your problem? From my perspective, it's like to communicate using questions. In the teams that I've worked with where I was most excited to continue working with, it's because they really knew what they were looking to get done. And it was a really difficult challenge. It was like a test for me. And that was really worth it. So speaking in questions, if we're talking about this last phase of like keeping momentum, is continuing feedback between the business and technical teams. How do you summarize the status of your project, of your system in a super lean way? What's a crystal clear memo that is sort of a state of your development, so you don't have different, like, for example, if you have different project teams all working towards getting your innovation out the door. Are people building redundant things? Is everyone aware of the state? Are we all at the right version? And there's a lot of progress that's slowed because people are not on the same page. So if you're leading these teams, how do you keep them concurrently up to date?
What do you think about vibe coding and all of these claims that we do not need to know how development works anymore?
What AI is really good at is content generation, starting with text, then code. It's moving into CAD systems, all types of media. That is basically, it's a commodity, right? Where does the value come from? The value comes from judgment. The value comes from how you manage the context of the solution you're trying to build towards. You may need to know less about a specific syntax for a programming language or all the most up-to-date packages that exist or whatever, but you still need to understand, how does the architecture of the system I'm creating relate to the context of the problem? The quality of your instruction leads to the quality of the results. And in the past, like if you look at how innovation processes were managed, it was all a process of communicating from management down to engineering what the requirements are. What do we need to give to the customer? That communication process now is given to everybody. Everybody has that power. Maybe on the surface, it looks like you don't need to understand, but to create a scalable and effective solution, you will need to understand that, right? It gives people a lot of power, but the responsibility comes with, okay, how do you manage?
Basically, everyone is managing these tools.
From my perspective, AI is basically making prediction free. Every type of AI feature or tool it's some type of curated prediction for some sub-process of some workflow. But free prediction means judgment becomes even more valuable. So in every context, whether it's I'm creating an image for a media campaign or a movie scene, or I'm doing accounting or making strategy or making code, right? Your ability to judge whether something's good or not, or whether it matches the right context of a problem, or even what should I direct attention to? What's worth human attention and what's worth machine attention? That's the core skill of the future in every domain, specifically innovation, because in the past, access, like it's really privileged, it's a privileged position to be able to have the time and the resources to work on innovation. That privilege now exists potentially for way more people. So the way that people think about creating new things and the frameworks for thinking about that, I think is something that becomes more and more important.
What do you think about automating specific tasks, for example, researching papers, AI agents for research?
I think it's great because when you're reading lots of papers, you get deep into a tentacle or like a deep branch of knowledge, and your ability to put new ideas together is sort of limited by how much information you can process. So you go into a specific area, you learn a lot about it, you're sort of familiar with the state of the art, and then you have just enough memory to sort of put together a couple of ideas. And that's great, but that actually slows us down from creating new things, right? There's so much knowledge out there that could be useful when connected and applied to a specific problem, but we just don't have the processing to be able to do that. And what's great about AI is that the context windows are expanding so much that if you accurately map the domain of your problems such that you can communicate that with an AI and have multiple agents seeking to find relevant ideas and you orchestrate them to give you a solution, it's incredible. Like if you think about, I forget his name now, but if you think about the way research clusters are organized, institutions across the university, across the country, or across the world, everybody has the ability to set up a research cluster with a machine. How much faster do we create new things? I mean, I'd like to think that's the ideal of most of the people working in that space, or most people building AIs, is that they sort of see it as a way to accelerate human progress.
Where do you think comes the judgment then in the automated research or clusters?
There's still a need for detailed education. My judgment is biased towards being a design engineer, right? I'm always thinking, how do I'm not a scientist. So I'm not thinking about the nuance of how someone conducted some experiment or whether it's credible or not. I'm more looking at it, does this enable me to create something new? How a scientist would use these tools, it's not really clear to me because they have different incentives. They have different biases. Some scientists take the credibility of a publication extremely seriously, the credentials of the scientist who wrote it. There's all types of politics involved in that world that I know nothing about. So how professional judgment changes, I don't know. That's a dilemma, right? Because it's also these cycles are going to move a lot faster, right? If you look at the rate of progress in AI, at least in that domain, publications are put on archive and then, 2 days later, an updated paper comes out. They're not peer reviewed, but that doesn't halt progress. How judgment evolves, it's an interesting question. Also, like, how do you map judgments within an organization? Like, that's actually something I'm really interested in is.
Can you explain more what do you mean with map judgment?
A company manufactures a specific type of machine and they get orders for this machine and they have to process the orders and then manufacture the machine based on the orders and send it to the customer. That whole process with an organization, there's many different types of decisions that happen throughout that process. So different types of human cognition that are used to read a document and make a classification and make a judgment and so on. And if you want to automate that with software or with AI or with physical automations, etc., you need to track, like, here is a decision made, and this is a good decision, this is a bad decision. This is what quality is. There's a tolerance, maybe there's a threshold, whatever. That's what I mean by mapping judgment. Most of the time, you don't think about that because those decisions are all made by people and it's sort of implicit to the role that they're in. But if you want to automate systems, you need to map all those decisions and make a trade-off and say, okay, is this something that an AI can do now or not? That's sort of what I mean by judgment mapping, or mapping how a process defined, how quality is defined in a process.
I think now would be a great time to introduce yourself. Can you tell us who you are, what exactly you're focusing on?
My name is Timotheus Gmeiner. I'm an engineer by training, and I'm a product manager now at Autodesk. I work on implementing different types of AI technology into design tools, specifically Alias and Vred. So Alias is a sort of a premium industrial design product, mostly used in automotive surfacing, so designing cars, basically every car on the road, and also premium products like premium electronic products like iPhones and things like that, designed with Alias. And Vred is a high-end visualization tool. Yeah, industrial design tools basically. So yeah, most of my day is working with AI researchers and product managers and customers to sort of blend those things together into new AI features, new design workflows.
You also had a deep tech startup. Can you tell me more about this one?
I worked with a consultancy in Berlin for a number of years, and I joined them to help commercialize some initial AI research they worked on. And we tried to do a spin out, like a technology spin out that didn't work for various reasons. And we then partnered with Autodesk and then were acquired by Autodesk. We sort of went full circle from doing basic or applied research and then translating it into an acquisition and then now into product features and things like that. So interesting experience, good experience. Definitely something to do again. Had all the ups and downs of trying to find a place for technology, a sort of technology push versus having the market pull it towards you, if that makes sense, right? We were sort of working on exploring generative AI technologies, I guess before people were calling it generative AI, but trying to figure out how we could apply it to the early stage of design processes to sort of help people connect the dots between different latent ideas. And it's sort of coincidence that it ended up in automotive, more of a function of where the technology was at than anything else. But yeah, that's been basically the last 5 years. It's been working on that project and trying to keep it going by running sort of innovation consulting projects with different companies, mostly in Europe, mostly automotive companies, some luxury brands, some American brands like Nike, things like that, but trying to help them make sense of how to apply AI. It's sort of a consistent pattern. What's the goal? What's the vision? What is the process you're trying to evolve? How can we structure this where you can create some type of value? The value is always different. Sometimes it's make more money. Sometimes it's build perception. Sometimes it's demonstrate feasibility. It really depends on the customer and what their objectives are. Sometimes they're not clear. So from my experience, a lot of the work is helping people get clarity on what they want, what their needs are. Even just to understand, especially if it's a big company, what their current system is. People get so often siloed into different teams and different divisions that they have lost track of the bigger picture. So sometimes coming in as a third party, as a consultant, is just showing them what that looks like, giving them insight into what is an opportunity for change that they otherwise wouldn't have seen.
What do you think about the AI strategies that these companies set up?
A lot of companies are sort of reacting fearfully. There's a lot of proactive push to try out new technologies, but people are not 100% clear on how to apply it or what it is or what it means for their business. Maybe they have a mandate from above. Everybody, we're AI first and we have to become 20% more efficient, figure it out. So there's a lot of scrambling to explore, but there's not a lot of clarity on what specifically I can do for which workflow in the organization. And that's going to take some time. So I think a lot of the strategies are a little bit chaotic. They'd have to be. If you just look at the rate of improvement of the technology, like the rate of change is so fast in 4 years, it's not infeasible to say that the technology will be 1,000,000 times better. And if we look at the rate of improvement of chips, of cloud infrastructure, of algorithms, so if it's 1,000,000 times better in 4 years, whatever strategy we have now is going to be wrong. So, or we need to adjust the framework for how we make plans. There's definitely some outdated strategies.
How do you think
Right.
they can better navigate that?
If we go back to the process I discussed before, I mentioned this concept of jobs to be done. this notion of mapping out the workflow. What is the human problem that you're trying to address? The thing I like about this job to be done framework is that if mapped correctly, it never changes. So the human need that we have today is the same need we had 100 years ago. The technical solution might change. So in this case, the jobs that these companies are serving today were the same 100 years ago, hypothetically. If they work to the jobs map and just focus on, okay, what of these unmet needs can be met faster, better, cheaper with this evolving AI tech, then there's less of an issue. If they're maybe not being very clear, but the job mapping stage helps people get clarity on what actually the problem is. So they can avoid focusing on hype. They can avoid focusing on what's happening in the outside world. That's from a strategic perspective, clarity on what the problem is to solve, right? A lot of teams that I've observed are taking actions to show that they're working on AI because that's what the market is doing. That's what everybody else is doing. So we need to have a strategy too. We need to be able to show that we're exploring this technology too. Bringing it back to focusing on what the actual problem is. Number two is, I think there's a big shift coming in terms of how everyday people within an organization can be used, can be leveraged, can be expanded. You know the concept of a chess centaur? Yeah. A centaur is like a Sagittarius, half a horse, half a man.
Yeah.
Imagine every employee has the upper body of a person and the lower body of the horse, but the horse is the machine, right? The horse is the AI, right? So it's like they're superhuman. So how can you make everybody superhuman? In chess, when AI went into chess, people were so afraid, okay, chess is going to be destroyed. No one's going to play chess anymore. That's not the case. Not only do more people play chess than ever, but the quality of chess, how much AI has improved the quality of people's ability to play chess. It's something there's even research studies that go into, okay, how much better have people become at this? What I'm trying to say is, how do organizations shift their AI strategy around, okay, how do we automate half of our staff away, but how do we do more? How do we focus on what our actual goal is and what the actual customer problem is? But how do we make all of our employees far more capable? How do we make work more human? If you think about all the different processes that happen in a company, how many of them are respectful of human ingenuity? Also, how many people are doing jobs that they don't like? They're doing them because maybe they don't believe that they can do something different, or they don't see a pathway to doing something different. And I think that the notion of just firing 20% of the people, I think, is super flawed, mostly because all those people have a lot of context for your business. They have a lot of context relevant to the business, relevant to the customer, and that all needs to be mapped into these tools. So if you let go of these people, you lose a lot of tacit knowledge that is vital to your business. Kind of a random perspective, but in general, that's what I think some of the issues are.
You put people always first. Why is that the case? When you talk about technology, integrating people into that rather than making.
I had the good privilege to be in a lot of different types of teams, like in different industries. Like I started in aerospace and worked in solar R&D, and then in jet engines and medical devices and software consulting. And I feel pretty confident that most things can be achieved. Like I've never really been in a team trying to solve a technology problem where they didn't make technical progress eventually. Right. The majority of the problem was all a people problem. Do these people believe that they can achieve something? Are they working together well? Are they motivated, excited? Do they have all their needs met? So at least in our, the state of humanity right now, most of the innovation problem is a people problem. And you can see it very clearly in, the difference between high performing teams and teams that are not doing so well. Are they all capable people? Yes, most people are capable and creative, and you can curate these teams to be filtered on capability. But the best teams I've been in, they've solved these soft problems really well. People were very aligned. They were in a sort of resonant mode. And I think that's sort of the critical problem for effective teams, is how do you get them into that resonant mode where they're synced and vibing with each other well. So I suppose that's why people first. Also because I think that creating new stuff is inherently human. we're a creative species. And I think that most people have the desire, at least, to create new things, to discover new things, to put new things together. Most of the reasons they don't is like circumstance, their condition, their belief system, whatever. So those are more human soft problems to solve, right? And if I think of my own experience, it's like blind luck and persistence that allowed me to get into the rooms that I was in. But I definitely had a lot of privileges as well. And in the next decade, the amount of people that will be able to have access to those types of opportunities can just expand. So that's another reason to sort of emphasize the human part of these problems, I think.
Now, if you're trying to bring together all the people, create the vision and whatnot, how do you do that? Is that like a whiteboard session? Are you on Miro and working remote? How does that look like?
When I've done it with customers, try to do it in smaller teams. So, 3, 4, maximum 10 people. And I've done that. And I think the best way to do it is sort of in person, in a comfortable place, whiteboard session, a lot of pre-planning, like I've done that recently for some product teams. I spent the last couple of months actually traveling between Europe and North America doing that for different product teams, sort of training them on AI and then running workshops to sort of plan out where can we go in the future. Most of the people that I've been working with are extremely experienced and they all have very strong opinions, and creating a loose scaffolding for people, loose scaffolding for your discussion with questions, seeds for questions to pull out opinions is the most useful process or stage from my perspective, because I know nothing about their domain and I just make assumptions and those assumptions activate them, right? And sometimes sometimes they get angry. But I think, at least from the very first stage, putting something on the wall that people can fight against, sort of, or push against or dispute, I think is the best way to learn something new, right? Especially if you come in as a consultant, sort of, or you come in as that sort of role, and you're working with a specialist, like a scientist or whatever. And you'll learn a lot very quickly, and you'll expose like a crevasse in people's thinking, because the specialists, by default, they're down into a deep valley of special expertise and they never come out of it. And you're forcing them to come up, which is uncomfortable, But it can also be very fun, because people get to see their ideas from new perspectives. So yeah, I would say the best way to get started is, like I said, what's the goal? What's the vision? What's the goal? What's the transformation, high level? What are your assumptions? And have people fight over it, basically, in a nice way. It's funny, actually, so much of, if I look back on the last 15 years, so much of everything I've done has just been that, right? That's the majority of it, because most of the work that I've done is, I've never really worked in scaling products, scaling production, whether it's hardware or software, or, scaling customers. It's always been from, we have a whisper of an idea, like a mouse fart of an idea, like nothing, basically, and some research, to like prototyping and maybe into production and initial scale production. So that whole process is so much just like, what is the map of what we're doing?
Are you like also using Gen AI in the process with brainstorming, fighting over assumptions?
Yes, in certain ways, but that's actually where I see the biggest opportunity for new tools. Because if you think about those initial stages, so much of it is, creating a loose map and then investigating deeper into, whether it's a whiteboard or notes. You're sort of trying to map out the context of the problem. What should we pay attention to and what shouldn't we? And within each of those subtle components of the system you're trying to work on or figure out, there's details. Those details take a lot of time to uncover, and specifically things like deep research and all the ecosystem of development tools that have come up to sort of help people build, customized type of deep research, agentic, RAG type solutions. There's a lot of opportunity to accelerate and make easier the process of exploring a new node of an idea as part of a subsystem and getting to a concrete answer about whether you should invest further or not. It's maybe getting a little bit too detailed, but I think there's a huge opportunity for how you accelerate the process. And that's sort of where I see myself continuing. Because a lot of if you look at like innovation processes or innovation process management, whatever, people are creating lots of frameworks. Like in the past, people created lots of frameworks and they guided their company through these frameworks to isolate ideas. But it's sort of just like nuanced information processing, you know? So how you model that into a software tool and connect it with agents, I think is we're going to see a lot more tools like that in the future. And maybe just to give a example, if you look at the most successful AI startups recently, tools like Cursor. Cursor's a coding IDE. It's a great tool, but what is it really doing? It's built off of VS Code, right? This open source tool. What Cursor does really well, at least from my perspective, is allows a developer to map their context into a project. There's different hierarchies of prompts that you can add: a system prompt, a project prompt, structures for what are cursor rules, so specific guidance or instructions for different categories of things you want to create. And that type of logic hasn't been mapped into how you manage innovation projects yet. And I think it will be, right? That's effectively, that process is what you do when you work with a consultant, when you work with McKinsey, you know. So I think that stuff will be mapped into tools and everybody will have access to that type of guidance, right? Or even sort of like a learning assistant, right? Like you teach through the Socratic method, right? You're going to have an assistant you can talk to. Because if you're creating a new product, like I think my bests are the most standard experience from my career so far. I had this great opportunity to work in this medtech startup, and the CEO said, I want you to make a diffuser for MRI machines. You have to do quality assurance testing with something called a phantom. So it's like this device you put into the machine, you scan it to check that the machine's working correctly. And so we had to invent one for diffusion tensor imaging for a specific type of MRI scan. And they gave us some research papers and said, great, study this and turn it into a product. That process took months, almost a year. I knew nothing about MRI physics beforehand, and I can't say I remember anything of it now. But during that process, it was like doing a graduate studies in this field, right? I learned so much, and the outcome was a product that they sold, and that was great. But it was an extremely exciting learning experience. And so I'd like to think that the way that AI comes into the innovation process in the future is more, you create things as a result of your learning process. So education becomes more about building things than it does just about, rote memorization for the purpose of memorization and things like that. Yeah.
Now, if you would want to hire someone that helps you with the product therapy for PhDs, what would you look for in these people?
Flexibility-based skills like background knowledge and technical diligence or technical capacity, but communication, ability to communicate, openness, the ability to sort of hold space for people. That's sort of how I came to the term therapy, product therapy. When you're trying to guide really intelligent people that have very specific domain expertise in business or finance or engineering or science, whatever, their opinions can be very strong. And there can be a lot of clashes and uncomfortable moments, and they can be very difficult to manage. And being flexible enough to sort of like guide those people is a big thing. And also for yourself, like if I was building a team of people to do this with me, which I haven't really thought about that much. Yeah, there's like a certain level of resilience to change, resilience to failure. Most of the things that I've worked on were like objectively failures. They didn't work. It was continuously not working, I hate to say process oriented, but because I think that sometimes you can get too committed to a process. But what I realize is that people need processes. Like people want a path, people want to be shown the way. People want a yellow brick road, and what I would be looking for is people who can define a compass, So rather than just giving people a path, people that know how to define a compass for people, right? Because there is no path into the future. You know what I mean? Like you need to define it for yourself.
And what about curiosity? You mentioned that before, that this is super important for innovation, but now for hiring a person, that would not be the case.
That's an oversight. Yeah, absolutely. Being curious. That's probably the core one, I guess. I mean, there are some people that are by default curious, and most of the people that I'm around are by default curious. So I just assume that, and that's sort of like an automatic filter. But that's, practically that isn't always the case. Like you need a balance, right, in your team. Like the one of my colleagues I've worked with the past 5 years, he's a very curious guy, but he's also very skeptical. And I think it's really good to have a great balance between someone who's extremely curious and exploring and pulling in new ideas, and someone who is very skeptical and can sort of balance you.
Curious and skeptical can be together in one person.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. But I totally think so. Yeah. I think but this is where I did mention openness. The thing is, I think that some people's curiosity is limited, right? There's certain ideas that they're not interested in at all. Like I'm interested in so many different things, but I'm open to more. So like, I feel like openness is like, if you're not openness to a new reality or new possibilities, you're not even going to be curious about them. You know what I mean? Like if your mindset is fixed, this is the world and this is who I am and this is what I can be and this is what I can do, then you're not going to be open and you're not going to be curious. So like being flexible, being open is sort of the root to all those things. And that's often harder to find. Like you can find a brilliant engineer or brilliant scientist technically. They're really capable. They really understand all the latest technology, latest techniques, or latest research, but they're extremely fixed in their thinking, are not open to change, are not open to a new perspective or a new reality. If you're trying to guide people, especially in a big organization, that's really a problem, because the people at the tops of these organizations, they're not just creating the product, they're trying to guide these minds, and like evolve them. And they need flexible guidance, basically. So yeah.
To sum it up, we need focus, clean up our mess, have a vision, then have team members that are flexible, open, but also very curious, can create a compass. You mentioned a lot about how you structure these meetings, about assumptions that people then fight over to get to conclusions. Better in person, not
Yeah,
online.
those three things: attention, context, and taste. Right? I think that myself, like when I think about my own work and the things that I'm working on, the teams that I work with, and I'm thinking about the future and how AI will affect all those things, I'm really just thinking on those three themes. I try to keep it really simple. It's like a filter to everything, right? What am I paying attention to? What's the context I manage? What's my judgment on those things? I think that's going to be really critical. I'm spending a lot of time writing on that and building training on that process, because and like I said, I'm applying this process to myself. How do I reduce the overwhelm with the current state of the world and try to make it simpler
Now,
and
if
easier
you
to
had to
manage?
give one amazing piece of advice for everyone who's innovating, is in research in the AI space, what would it be?
Don't be afraid. At the root of any shift or taking a new course of action or trying something new, the root of it is always fear. Like if you're looking at like, why are people not doing it, or why is it the hesitation? You can learn so much about why things aren't working by trying to uncover, why are people afraid? Why people are taking a change or starting a new job or changing a process, or you're starting a new company. Where is the fear? How is that fear causing an action? So yeah, don't be afraid. That's a big one.
I think that's a very beautiful piece of advice. Thank you also so much for this podcast session.
Thank you.